If you're using Claude Code, you must know these 7 tips to get the best results when creating and editing code in your projects. Stick around and let me show them to you. The first tip is you should be using the Claude Markdown files. The Claude Code documentation refers to the Claude Markdown files as the memory of your project. This is sent with every single prompt you send over to the AI. So in your project, you should at the very least have a Claude Markdown file to tell the system what your project has. It should include a description of the project, what different files do, and any type of code styles you want to have, and anything else that is important to know about the project. If you already have an existing project and you don't have a Claude Markdown file, you can run the /init command inside of Claude Code, and it will generate a Claude Markdown file for you for the project. That's a great way to get started, but you should go into that file and make sure that the information in there is accurate and complete. For instance, if you want to include information that's not included in there, go ahead and add it in, and that'll make sure that when you submit requests to create or edit code, that it's going to be following your directions without you having to tell it every single time when you create new prompts. You can also have additional Claude Markdown files in subdirectories of your project if you need to have specific information, settings, etc. that apply to different folders. Like maybe you have a backend folder and a front end folder in your project, and you want to include different information and only have the top level markdown file have more general information about your project without bogging down the details about your individual backend and front end tech stacks. One other file you should know about is your personal Claude Markdown file, and that's going to be your global personalization settings that should apply as like the fallback defaults for anything you do. In my previous video where I actually built the same application 3 times with different prompts, I complained that JavaScript that was being created by Claude kept using object-oriented classes instead of functional, which I prefer. And I realized that I could actually add that into a global Claude Markdown file and say, when appropriate, and using JavaScript, prefer functional solutions over object-oriented classes. So I actually tried that real fast and added that. That's all I did was I added a new global Claude Markdown file, added that preference in, and then I regenerated the simplest result from the using the simplest prompt. And then I went and looked to see what it generated for the JavaScript. And lo and behold, instead of using classes, which it used in all 3 of the solutions that it originally generated, this time all of these solutions in JavaScript were actually using functional methods. So pretty good to know. You can put any type of preferences, any style guidelines, anything else that you think is important to include at a global level across all your projects in that file as well. The great thing is that having all these markdown files across your project and in your personal directory, Claude knows that there's a hierarchy to them. So it'll work backwards and figure out what is the most specific Claude Markdown file to use, and anything in the more specific ones will override settings from the more generalized ones. So if you have a hierarchy of them in your project and you have a personalized one, and let's say in your project you say to use classes in your JavaScript files, but your personal say to prefer functional, well, the project one will actually override, and Claude should know which one to use, but it'll still include all the different files. It's just that it'll interpret them in the correct hierarchy of importance. So moving on to tip number 2, this is another use of markdown files inside of Claude Code. What you can do is you can write your prompt inside a markdown file. This way you can make it as complicated as you want to and not have to manually type it out or type it in like a text editor and copy it in, but instead put it into a separate markdown file in your project, and then just use the @ symbol inside of Claude Code and the path and file name that you just created for the markdown file, and it'll run that markdown file as if it was a prompt. The great thing about this is you could, number one, you could make sure that you have the exact prompt you want to crafted in a separate file. And number 2, you can actually, maybe keep these files in your Git repository and have a history of the prompts that you ran to generate the code. A related tip for using files instead of Claude Code, you can also tell Claude Code to reference existing files such as images, PDFs, CSV, JSON, etc., and it will know how to interpret those. This is especially great if you use images to generate mocks for your UI. So like Claude Code could actually look at those images and know how to generate the HTML and CSS and everything from that. So keep that in mind as well. And obviously, if you're writing your prompt in Markdown, you can reference the additional files from that Markdown file as well. All right, moving on to tip number 3, and that is use the /clear command often. The reason you want to do this is because it's going to clear the context of your current window. As you go through Claude Code, as you type in different prompts and import different files and tell it what to do, you're going to be building up this context window, which remembers everything you've typed into it, and it applies all that information to what it generates on the output side. Well, if you're changing gears, and let's say you're working on the front end and you've told it to use these images for mocks and is creating this front end code, and now you're switching over to a back end code, you don't want it to remember all the front end images and all this other additional instructions that you've passed in. That's just going to bog down the request when you send it over to the LLM. Instead, you want to clear all that history and only send over the new information that says, hey, I want you to do some backend stuff now. So by typing /clear, you're going to wipe out that context, and your result for the new request you make is going to be more accurate because it's not trying to adhere to those previous commands you gave it, which have no bearing whatsoever on what you're now trying to do. Another great example is if you're using test-driven development, it's a good idea after you have it write the tests, you want to go ahead and do a /clear so it can then write the tests using a completely new context, no biases from the original request to write the tests. This way they're completely independent actions. So remember, use the /clear command often. All right, tip number 4 is to use planning mode. Now, normally when you give Claude Code a prompt, you're going to see it first break down the task into a bunch of subtasks, and it's going to show you that list briefly, and then just dive right into running through all those tasks and making changes to your code. Obviously, if you haven't given it permission to edit your code, it's going to then start prompting you, can I make this change? Can I edit this file, etc. But if you gave it permission, you're going to see it run through a whole bunch of changes, and you don't have any control over what those steps were after it planned them out. But if you go into planning mode, then you can actually pause after that initial step where it breaks down the task you gave it into subtasks, and you can approve its plan of action before it starts wasting any time going and running those subtasks. Now, this is great if you're worried that the task is going to take a very long time and you want to have more control at the beginning so you don't waste time, potentially money, your available tokens in your plan on a very long amount of runtime that turns out to be something you have to throw away completely. So the way to activate this is hit Shift-Tab twice, and it'll tell you at the bottom that you're now in planning mode. And what will happen is when you type in your prompt, it will plan out the actions, and then it will actually wait for you to confirm that that's the actions you want to take before it moves on to implementing them. If you decide that you want to tweak what it offered, hit Escape, and that'll allow you to then give it more prompts to refine the process, to refine its task list. You could also try just telling it in the prompt that you only want it to plan out the changes. Don't make any actual changes to the code or implement anything. But if you actually want to be in official planning mode, the Shift-Tab twice, that's the way to do it. So anyway, give that a try and see if it works for you. Moving on to tip number 5, and that is think levels. This works great with the previous tip for planning mode. Basically, inside of Claude Code, out of the box, when you give it a prompt, it's going to use the base think mode, which is not going to be trying super hard to figure out a solution. It's going to work well, but if you really want it to think on what it's doing, you can actually tell Claude Code to spend more time, more thought power on what it's doing. And the way you do that is you could use a certain keyword inside your prompt. And the basic one is think. If you tell it, I want you to think about this problem, that immediately elevates the amount of processing power it's going to apply to that job. And there's actually additional levels above that. So you can tell it to not just think, but think hard, think harder. You can go the highest level, which is you want it to ultra think. And that'll obviously spend a lot of time doing the thinking on this. And the reason this works right with planning is because that you really want to get the decision-making process done as smart as possible. So if you give it one of these think modes at the beginning, it's going to come up with the best possible solution and break it up into the best pieces that can then be worked on sequentially down the road. Or if you know that one of your subtasks will require more brain power to get a better solution, that's where you could also throw one of these keywords into. So anyway, keep in mind that the word think and related terms do matter to Claude Code and will actually improve your results. Tip number 6 is custom commands. If you have a repeated prompt that you use all the time, you can actually turn that into a custom / command that you can directly access from your Claude Code terminal. To do this, I recommend just reading the documentation, but you basically end up putting that command in a markdown file in your home directory under the .claude/ I think it's the commands folder. So by putting the command in there, you can now reference that same markdown file. So if you called something like log analysis, log-analysis, you can type /log-analysis, give it some arguments, and then it will run that prompt with the arguments passed in. And inside your markdown file, you can use the arguments keyword to use whatever you pass in from the command line, and it'll go ahead and use that prompt to run your command. This is useful for, as I said, maybe something like log analysis, or maybe to debug an error that you got, maybe to, if you have MCP set up to GitHub or to something else, you can maybe automatically push your Git commits, automatically create pull requests, maybe automatically pull down a GitHub issue, open a branch, and try to solve the issue. You can do a lot of different things with this as long as you make your commands, generic enough to run what you want to run. So it's a fun thing to try out and see what you can turn into a simple command that would normally require you to have a prompt that you run for every single time that you need to solve the same solution. All right, on to our last and 7th tip here. And it's a bit of an advanced one, but I wanted to include it because I learned about a Git feature I didn't even know existed by learning about this tip. And that is leveraging Git work trees in order to run multiple Claude agents at the same time. So first, to explain what a Git work tree is, which is what I just learned about this recently, and I've been using Git forever. So it shocks me I didn't even know about this. It's amazing. But basically, you can have a Git repository checked out, and you can have multiple folders referencing different branches from that same repository without having to individually clone that Git repository every single time. So if you have a very large repository, that's great because you don't have to download, tens or hundreds of megabytes of information from the repository over and over again. And instead, you can have each work tree referencing one single repository. And it guarantees that each branch you're running off of is distinct. You don't have to worry about, if you suddenly have to change context, let's say you're working on a large feature and now you have to switch over to fix a quick bug fix. You don't have to go and stash your changes or create a temporary branch and make a commit. You have to remember to squash. Instead, you can just make a work tree and jump over to a whole new branch and a whole new directory without ever really leaving that Git environment inside your command line. And the cool thing about doing it this way too is once you have multiple work trees set up, you can run Claude Code in each one, and they're all separate. So if you had independent features that you wanted to work on at the same time from Claude Code, you can have a work tree for each one in its own folder, start up Claude Code in each one, and then give each Claude Code its own instructions, and each one will then operate independently and simultaneously on its own branch. And then you can just merge those changes into your mainline branch as they complete, and you're verified that that's the code you actually want to merge in. Pretty cool feature, and it's fun to play with. Like I said, it's advanced, but it's a little of a free tip for Git as well, which again I think is a pretty cool tip, even without the Claude Code stuff. All right, so those are my tips. Thanks for watching. Hopefully those give you a big boost in using Claude Code in your own projects. Let me know how this helps you out. If you have any other tips that I missed that you think are really cool, let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.